my kitchen. Now on this week's video tutorial, I have a really fun cake decorating idea for you. So whether you're creating a cake for somebody who loves books, or maybe you know somebody who loves magic and wizardry, I'm going to be showing you how to make this stack of magical spell books. We've also got this magic wand which is casting a spell all around the outside of our cake. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to start with is the cake. I'm going to be creating two separate books. So I've got two rectangles of cake. Now each of these cakes measures 4.5 inches by 6 inches and they're around 1.5 inches in height. Now I'm going to start by cutting this down. I've got 2 layers. And on one side, I'm going to take my serrated knife and just curve that edge over. Now I have had my cakes wrapped in cling film and popped in the fridge for a few hours just to make this a little bit easier. And just at the bottom, do exactly the same. I'm then going to do exactly the same to my other cake. Now to fill and cover my cakes, I've got a batch of my white chocolate ganache and just let it sit at room temperature until it had firmed up slightly. I've then gone in with my electric whisk until we've got this nice spreadable consistency. For my first cake, I'm just going to start building this on my glass board, adding a thin layer of that ganache in the center before going in with a crumb coat. So all a crumb coat is doing is just locking in any of those loose crumbs. Now on the corner of my book, I'm just using my offset spatula and bringing it one way, and on the opposite corner, bringing it the opposite way. On that back edge, just trying to curve that ganache around. So this is going to give us the spine of our book. I'm going to pop my book into the fridge until that is just slightly firmed up so we can put our final coating of ganache over the top. For my second cake, I'm going to do exactly the same, but I'm actually going to build this one on top of a small cake board. So I've cut this out the exact same dimensions of my cake, and this cake board is around 2 millimeters in thickness. Now the reason for putting this cake on a cake board is I am going to be stacking my cakes. I'm going to be placing that top cake slightly off center. I will be putting dowels in to just support the corners of the book. So we want a cake board that can sit on top of those dowels. So there we have our second book covered in our crumb coat. So I'm going to pop this in the fridge with the other book. Once they've come out of the fridge and that crumb coat has firmed up, I'm going to add another thin layer of my ganache, creating sharp corners on one side and that slightly curved edge on the other side. Once you're happy with how that's looking, we can pop this one back in the fridge. I'm going to do exactly the same to my other cake. Whilst my cakes are in the fridge, I'm going to work on my cake board. So here I've got a 12-inch drum board and this one just measures 1 centimeter in height. Now you can just cover your boards in a single color. I'm going to actually make my board look like it's stone. So I'm going to take some white fondant and I'm going to color this in a gray color. So I'm just using some black food gel and work that through. It's going to give us a gray color. Now I'm going to keep mine quite light and I've actually stopped before all of that colour has combined. Similar to if you were marbling your fondant. You then want to roll this out until it's large enough to cover your board. I'm then going to run over the top of my board with some water so that that fondant will stick. Now if you've seen my tutorial showing how I cover my cake boards in fondant, you may have seen a similar technique, but I'm going to be using this tool. Now it's similar to a ball tool, but we have this curve and I'm going to be using the smaller end. So on my board I'm going to be adding in some lines and these are going to be the stones. I'm then going to go in on the corners of those rectangles and just round off those edges, pushing into that fondant. I'm going to take my Dresden tool and just add in some lines, just going over the top, just moving that fondant around, just roughing them up slightly. I've then got some shadow grey edible tint and a small amount of black. So all we're trying to do is just pick out those shapes. So with a fluffy brush, I'm going to take, first of all, some of that shadow grey, just running it along the edge where we pushed in all those lines. You then want to mix some of that black with the grey and with a slightly smaller brush, just adding in some finer detail. Around my board, I've then just got this silver sparkly ribbon, which I'm gonna fix into place with some double-sided tape. So there we've got our cake board. My books have been in the fridge and that ganache has firmed up. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is add the pages around the side. For this, I've got some fondant and I've added in a small amount of ivory. Now, before we add the pages on, I've just mixed some icing sugar with some water to make a glue. And I'm gonna add that onto those 3 flat sides. I want to roll my fondant out into a strip that's large enough to wrap around those 3 sides. So I've got that strip around 3 millimeters in thickness. Down one side, cut a straight line, and I'm gonna flatten that with that straight edge along the front and also bring that onto the sides and go in with my smoothing paddles. Using these to make sure that I've got nice sharp corners. I'm then gonna use my craft knife and I just wanna cut off the excess. The 3 tools that I'm going to be using for this is a ruler, my craft knife and my Dresden tool. So I'm starting with my ruler and on all 3 sides adding in some straight lines. Now the lines so far are quite faint, so I'm going to go over the top with my Dresden tool, just pushing some deeper ones in, trying to keep them as straight as possible. I'm then going to use my craft knife and just bring it back and forward on those corners. Going in with my Dresden tool where we've got those little cuts, pulling them around slightly. So it looks like it's just the pages of a book that's been well read. So just keep adding lines in until you're happy with how that's looking. I'm just going to take some of the shadow grey edible tin and just mix it with a little bit of white dust, or you can also mix it with a little bit of corn flour. I'm just trying to lighten it slightly, taking off the excess powder and just on the edges, just a little hint of colour. So there we have the pages on our book. I'm going to do exactly the same to my other book. Once both of the books have pages, we're now ready to add the covers onto the outside. For my books, I'm going to be using some brown fondant for the book that's going to go on the top. For this, I just started with some Teddy Bear Brown by the Sugar Paste and added some dark brown food gel into this. The reason I started with a colour to begin with was so that I didn't have to add as much of my food gel. For the book on the bottom, I'm going to be using this dark red burgundy colour. So I started with some pre-coloured red by Smart Flex and just coloured this with some of the burgundy food gel by Wilton. The first thing I want to do is work out how wide my strip of fondant needs to be to wrap over the cake. I want it to overhang by around 1/2 centimetre, so I can see that it's going to need to be 17 centimetres. Before I roll out my fondant, I'm also going to take just some of that water mixed with icing sugar that we used on the side and just paint this over the top. Now I'm making wizard themed books, but depending on the type of books that you're making, you can make the covers any colour that you like. Now I've rolled my fondant out until it's around 4 millimetres and I want it the same thickness all the way through. I'm then going to use my ruler, measure out that 17 centimetres. Now with the excess, I'm going to pop this to one side as I will need this to do the bottom of my book. I don't want this to change shape as I lift it, so I've just placed it onto a chopping board and I'm just going to lightly just leave the edge overhanging. I can then bring in my cake and I'm going to line that up, just bringing it 1/2 centimetre forward. Before I let that fall off of the chopping board, I'm just going to use my ruler along the front just to straighten that up slightly. Now, if you're finding that the corners of your book are starting to bend over, you could pop a cocktail stick in, or I've just got some acetate and I've cut out an L shape carefully just underneath that edge, just until that dries, and then we can pull those out. On the back, I'm going to push in my fondant and we want to really get it in that curve. Chop off the excess. Use my flexi smoother. So we just want to push that underneath the book. Now I am going to be putting the bottom parts in when we add it onto our board, but for now I'm going to add some detail. So I'm going to take my ruler again And where we've got it curving over, I just want to put a line down, and then I can go in with my Dresden tool. I'm going to be adding the name of the book onto the spine of this one, and then the one that's going to be going on top, I'm going to be adding the name on the front. So to add lettering onto my books, I'm going to be using the new Spellbound letter set by Sweet Stamp. This letter set is perfect if you're making a wizard or a magic themed cake. I've got the larger of the two Spellbound sets, but they do also do a smaller set. So I'm just going to remove the letters that I'm going to need. Now on the book that's going to go on the bottom along the spine, I'm just going to add potions. For the book that's going to go on the top, I'm going to keep it quite generic and just go with Spellbook. Now, as well as the letter sets, in the Sweet Stamp Spellbound range, they also have these really cool element sets. They do outbossers, which you can use for cupcakes. They've got cutters and stencils and sprinkles. So there is so much to go on your magical or wizard themed cakes. Now, they have given me a 10% off code for everything on the Sweet Stamp website, including the Spellbound range. So all you have to do is enter Cakes by Linz at the checkout on their website, and I will put all the details in the description below. So I've got the letters that are going to spell out potions down the side, and I'm going to be using my pickup pad. I've got a little guide, so I'm going to use this to work out the positioning of my letters. So I'm going to push that onto the top of my letters. So when I take that off, it's just going to create this little stamp. I can then place this up against my fondant, and I'm just going to rock that pickup pad just backwards and forwards just to lightly emboss those letters. So as you can see, we've got potions written down the side. With some of that leftover fondant, I've cut out 2 strips, and these just measure 1 centimeter in width. I'm going to add a small amount of edible glue, starting where we created that seam. I'm going to add these onto my book. I've then got a small amount of terracotta edible tin and a little bit of brown, and I'm just going to use this along that seam that we created, and this is just going to age the book. So I'm just adding a bit to those edges, just making sure that I don't get it on any of the pages. And I'm just going to do a bit around the letters. So once you're happy with this one, I'm going to pop this to one side and work on my second book. Just adding in that seam where the cover would fold back. On the front of this one, I'm going to have Spellbook. So just as I did before, I'm going to lay out my letters on that plastic guide, and then place this on the front of my book and just push down to emboss those letters. Now, to match the potions on the other book, I'm also going to put spells on the spine of this book. Add in 2 strips along that back, just as I did on the red one. I've then got some brown and some chocolate brown, and just as I did on the red book, I'm going to run that up that seam on the corners, just helping to age our book. To paint my letters, I'm going to be using some gold luster dust, and this is just the pure gold by Sweet Sticks. I'm going to mix in some dipping solution. Now, if you're looking for an alternative to the dipping solution, I do have another video where I run through my 6 favourite things to add to luster dust to create a metallic paint. So I will put a link to that on the screen and in the description below. I'm then going to use a really fine brush and just go in and fill in those letters on the front of this book, down the spine, and also on my potions book. Once our books have been painted, I'm going to put them together on my cake board. Facing down, a little bit of ganache, carefully lift my cake up and just place it in the center. Before I add my next book on the top, I need to add the back cover. Taking some of that red, I'm going to roll this out into a thin strip, which is the same thickness as our top cover. I'm going to cut out 3 strips, which are the same thickness as the overhang that we have. Run some edible glue along that bottom edge. Taking my first piece, you want to tuck it in at the side so it looks like it's joining the back. And I'm also going to push in the little dent to match this side. Now on the corner, I'm going to chop it at an angle, add on some more edible glue. Now with this piece, I'm going to start by chopping it at a 45-degree angle so that I can join it to the piece that we've already added. Where we created the dips on our board, if you're finding that your fondant is just going down there, take another piece of that acetate, which is just going to help keep that elevated until it's dried. So there we have the first book. The next thing to do is add our book on top. So I've got some of the square easy dowels and I'm just going to push these in, marking on there the height and just using some scissors trim that down. Now I'm going to make a few of these in exactly the same height. I'm adding these in just because my cake is going to be slightly off center, so the weight isn't going to be balanced on the top. So I'm just pushing them in where I know they're going to sit underneath that top book. This book is quite easy to pick up because we do have that board on the bottom. I'm going to slightly off center that. Then in exactly the same way as I did the red, I'm going to start with the piece along the front, and you want to glue this to the front of those pages. So again, trimming it down to a 45-degree angle. If you do have any problems with it falling down, you can do exactly the same as we've done with the corners and just add a cocktail stick or a bit of acetate underneath. So now we've got our two books in place. You can leave your cake like this. I'm going to be adding a wand and also adding a little bit of magic. For my wand, I'm going to take a bamboo skewer and I just want to work out how long I need it to be. So I want it leaning up against the cake. Trim that down around 21 centimeters. I'm then going to take some more of my brown fondant and I'm going to add a little bit more dark brown into that. I want this to set a little bit firmer, so I'm going to add just a small amount of Tylose powder and just mix that all through. So I'm going to start with a small ball of my brown and just start to roll this into a thin sausage shape. Push that through the center. And in terms of the wand, you can make your wand look however you like. So I'm going to roll this onto that skewer, just trying to get it as thin as I can. And when it comes off the ends, I can chop some of that off so that I can continue rolling. So I'm trying to get it as thin as I possibly can. Now on my cake, I want to make it look like magic is coming out the end of my wand. So I'm going to put in a small hole in there. I'll be able to push a wire through. I'm going to take another small ball and just roll this out until it's quite chunky. I'm then going to cut this down, add on some edible glue and wrap this around the bottom. Now I can just push it at the bottom of my wand and I'm going to use my Dresden tool just to go in and just add some detail, bring in some lines. And as I said, you can make your wand exactly how you like. This is just quite a generic brown wand, so you can add in any details. I've then got some of those brown shades that were left over from when we did our book, and I'm just going to go over the top of our wand just so it doesn't look as flat. So there we have just a really fun wizard's wand. Now the last thing that I want to do is make it look like there's magic coming out of the wand and swirling around our books. Now to do this, I'm gonna make some rice paper sails. So I'm gonna be using some Vietnamese rice paper, and if you want to see a video where I go into more detail about how I use these, I will put a link on the screen and in the description below. Now in order to shape my rice paper sails, I've got some parchment paper. So I'm just going to start by scrunching up my parchment paper so that my sails aren't completely flat. I'm then going to start shaping each piece around my cake so that I know that when my rice paper is dry, I can then fit it back around my cake. Now for the sails, I've cut some down so they're leaf shape, and the one that's going to come out of my wand, I'm going to cut so it's tapered down on one side, and I'm just going to cut into the top like so. I'm going to take my rice paper and submerge that into some water until it goes nice and soft. I'm then going to take some water-based food gel, so I've got some blue and a little bit of jade. I'm going to water these down. So you want to leave it in the water until the pattern on the surface has disappeared. I'm going to take that out and just lay that on a silicone mat, wet my brush and just bring some colour onto that sail. Now this one is going to go into the end of my wand, so I'm going to take a small piece of wire, start to wrap that around. Now, I've then got a finished sparkle shimmer pump before bringing back in my parchment paper and just laying this one over the top. I'm then going to take my next piece of rice paper and just place that into my water. Now, if you do want to know more about creating rice paper sails, then make sure you do head over to the tutorial that I've got that's dedicated just to these. Now, once you have a selection of your sails, you can either leave these overnight to dry, or I'm going to preheat my oven to 65 degrees Celsius, so the temperature is very low, and I'm going to pop these in for around an hour to 2 hours until they have dried out and hold their shape. Once my rice paper has dried, I can then remove it from the parchment paper. As you can see, we're left with these really shimmery, translucent shapes. I've got my wand and I've got my sail. I'm going to trim this down slightly, leaving around 2 inches. Pop that wire into some edible glue before pushing it into the end of my wand. Bring back in my stack of book cakes, and the first thing I'm going to do is just remove those pieces of acetate and then want to place on my wand. So I don't want it covering the names on my books too much, and I'm going to have it coming over just with that sail resting on the edge of the book. And the great thing about using the wire in the end is I can just bend that round depending on where I want it to go. I'm going to be using 3 other pieces. The first piece I've also added a wire into, which I'm going to bend that round. I'm going to push this between the top of my book and the cover so it looks like that magic is coming out of the wand and flowing round. I've then got 2 pieces that I'm going to be adding onto the front and just making them look like they join together. Once I'm happy with the positioning, I'm going to add on a little bit of edible glue to stick those into place. I want to make it look like where this magic is coming out is slightly reflecting on the board. So I've got some luster dust, I've got some ocean blue and a light silver. And on my board, just underneath where it would be shining down, I'm just going to add a small amount of that. I'm going to add a very small amount just on the edge of my book, taking off a lot of that excess, building up that shimmer and sparkle. So using a combination of the blue and the grey and doing the same on the other ones. So just around the one that's on the board, just adding a bit of shimmery blue. So here we have the finished spellbook cake with our 2 books stacked on top of each other. We've then got this magical wand which is casting a spell all around the outside of our cake. I really hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial and will be able to use some of these techniques in your own cake decorating. If you have enjoyed the video, as always, don't forget to give it a like. And if you'd like to see more videos like this and you haven't already, then don't forget to subscribe to the Cakes for Names YouTube channel. You can also hit the notification bell next to the subscribe button, and this will alert you every time we upload a new video. So until next time, bye!